Well, good evening everybody, I'm Wilmar Taal from the Netherlands, you can hear by my accent. I work in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and every morning when I came by train and I started walking from the station to the museum, I always passed the Spiegelgracht, one of the canals in Amsterdam. And Spiegelgracht number 22 is quite important for the story of Bob Richelle, because that's the place where he finally got inducted into the world of the occult. So if Spiegelgracht 22 never existed, the cabinet over there would be empty. What happened? Bob Richelle was born on April 22nd, 1925 in Rotterdam. Rotterdam, as you know, got bombed by the Germans, and the Germans overrun the city quite quickly. And a lot of people were homeless from that point on, and Amsterdam reached out to the people of Rotterdam to say, we can take 3,000 of you in here, and the family Richel decided to move to Amsterdam. Bob lived through the Second World War until 1944, when he was drafted for the Dutch Labor Service, and the Labor Service was a kind of a replacement for the army service, the how do you call it in English? Something like the
Land Army.
The Land Army. The labor service was something like you were obliged to give labor for 6 months in a part of the Netherlands where you were needed. Bob was in Limburg, in the northern part of Limburg, and there he was confronted with the end of his 6-month term, and he was called in the office of the commander, and he said, you can choose, you can go home. If you go home, there are two big guys who are going to kick your ass. And if you sign up for another 6 months, nothing will happen. So Bob signed on for another 6 months. But Bob also knew, if you sign on for another 6 months, you're going to the Eastern Front. You're going to the war zone in Russia. Bob didn't like that idea one bit, so one night he left his labor clothes on his bed, took on his civilian clothes, and he went. He could not go west, because on the west he had the Meuse River, and Meuse River was heavily guarded around the time because of the Allied landings in Normandy. So Bob had to go east into Germany. And that's where we lose track of him, because we don't know what happened to Bob in Germany, but we do know he was kind of laying low there. We have one letter of Bob Richelle from 1944 July, where he says to his mother, I'm in Germany, I'm living with a farmer, I'm working here, I'm okay, give my love to my father and my brothers and sisters, and that was it. The most peculiar thing was that the letter stated it was in the Dutch language, and it was on the envelope and on the letter. So it meant that Bob was incarcerated somewhere. We don't know where, we don't know when, but by piecing together little scraps of evidence, we could make out a story that could have happened. Bob's letter was posted in a town called Veldhuizen, but Bob said he was in Herne near Dortmund. That's 125 kilometers south of where the letter was posted, so that story doesn't add up. So I was wondering, what is so special about Veldhuizen? Well, it seemed that Veldhuizen was the southern point of what was called the Emsland camps. And the Emsland camps were camps formed by the Nazis in 1934 for their political opponents. And eventually those camps were rehoused with French prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, people from the Dutch resistance who were caught, and people who ran away from the Dutch labor service. And eventually we came to the conclusion that Bob should have been incarcerated in Bothorn. Why? In Bothorn were also the French, and Bob also always had a special relationship with France. He was mightily interested in Paris. Every year he would go with his wife to Paris, so there was this connection. And what Bob wrote to his mother, that he was living with a farmer, the people incarcerated in Bothorn were allowed to stay with farmers in the vicinity, to provide labor and to stay there if needed. So they didn't have to be incarcerated in the camp itself. Bob would never talk about it. He would never say anything about what happened to him in World War II. When the war was over, Bob was kind of a short time in the Dutch Liberation Army, the Binnenlandse Strijdkrachten we call it, the interior forces. And after that he was given a grant furlough from the army, and he signed on to be a war volunteer for Indonesia. He was actually on the run for something. Indonesia didn't bring Bob what he expected. He expected to be traveling abroad and to meet beautiful women and to have adventures, and it became actually the opposite of that. He was met with hatred, he was met with violence, and soon Bob's mental health was deteriorating under that strain. So after a year he was already sent home to the Netherlands. And that's actually where Bob's foray into the world of the occult started, because he was very angry with God. He was raised a Roman Catholic, and he couldn't understand why God would allow concentration camps to happen, violence to happen, everything that made up World War II to happen. So Bob started turning to the opponent, the devil. And you see that from 1945, that the devil starts to make a more important appearance in his artworks. And a lot of people in Bob's vicinity were worried about that. There was one letter of his colleague Frits Korteweg, with whom he worked at a publishing company. And Frits was asking Bob, if you let the devil work into you, is there still anything positive left for you? And that was one of the times that Bob maybe have been susceptible for some outside input, but Bob was not very much a listener. He was someone who had his mind set on things and he went for it. So in 1949 he met up with this figure called Jan Willem Stickers, and Jan Willem Stickers was also known under his pseudonym Abba Serapion. And Stickers was the head of a small church congregation in Amsterdam called the Orthodox Church of the Chaldean Succession. And Stickers was quite a character. He was once having a small church community in the Muiderstraat in Amsterdam, and he had on the top floor his chapel, and behind the chapel was a small distillery of gin. So when the police came in because Stickers was stealing electricity from the building next door, they found the distillery and was Mr. Stickers, what is this? Well, I don't have a clue. The contractors to put it there, and I just allow it. So Stickers was eventually brought before the court and judged for illegal distillery of gin. When the judge said, Mr. Stickers, I think you like a little drink, Stickers replied with, well, Your Honor, you look like you could use a drink yourself, which landed him for 4 months in prison. That was the figure where Bob now was affiliated with. And why was Bob so interested in this person. Bob held a scrapbook about Mr. Stickers, about Abba Serapion, and in that scrapbook there was a small article about Stickers giving a course in magic. He was giving a 14-date course in magic, and the first date was always in the American Hotel in Amsterdam. From that time we also see that Bob is making more drawings of Baphomet. And so I started to gather maybe Stickers introduced Bob to the works of Eliphas Levi. There was another source, Bob's son, who I spoke on a very sunny day at the station of Utrecht. And his son told me his mother was quite agitated with Bob because he tried to join the Church of Satan. That was in 1949. There was no Church of Satan right then in Amsterdam. So what was happening? Well, I found out that Bob's first wife lived at the same house where Stickers lived, the Spiegelgracht 22, where Bob entered in September 1949 to join Stickers, to be his apprentice. And there was one thing with Mr. Stickers that nobody actually knew, because it was forbidden in the Netherlands in those times, but Mr. Stickers was gay. And we suspect that he tried to seduce Bob. Bob, being a heterosexual, scared of the thought and jumped at the first opportunity to have a girlfriend, and that was Ruth Seisler, who lived also with her mother and her sister at the same address, because we have to take into account that it is 1949. There aren't too many houses available for people. There's a lot of people were boarding rooms in Amsterdam. Bob was married with Ruth in 2 months' time. So she was pregnant of his first child in a week later. Why? Well, we found out that his wife was stateless. She came from the Czechoslovakia. Most German people who lived there were driven out by the Russians and by the partisans of the Czechoslovakia to go live in Germany, somewhere place else. And the mother of Ruth was a Dutch woman, so she could repatriate to the Netherlands, but she had to find a way to get her daughters to follow as well. Well, she found that way. Somewhere in 1948 the daughters followed, and they came in Groningen, and from there they moved to Amsterdam because there was a better opportunity for a job. And that's where Bob met her, and where his first marriage began, and where his wife was not pleased with him because he was trying to join the Church of Satan. Why she thought that might be because Bob was making drawing after drawing of this Baphomet figure. And some of those drawings are right here in the library. And some of those drawings are in the cabinet over there. And Baphomet would still be a red thread to Bob's life. And when in 1953 he met Louise Eldermans, he finally found the master he was looking for, which was her father, Mr. Johannes Hendrik Willem Eldermans, whose work we also can find in the cabinet over there. Eldermans was more first in works of the occult. He was more studied, and Bob adored the man to bits. He placed him on a pedestal, and he kept on doing that until Eldermans was passed away in 1985. He still revered the man. In 1985 is also the time when the Richel collection, as we know it here, started to form, because Bob got his inheritance from his father-in-law. And that's also where we are going to tie into the second book that I'm publishing this year through Troy Books. That's the Gnome Manuscript Part 3. because the Gnome manuscript was inherited by Bob in 1985, and he started compiling it from the works from his father-in-law to make sense out of the works. He tried to combine all the information into small folders in which the topics would make sense, because Eldermans was always over the place. He took a year, 1946 for instance, and he started collecting all kinds of information about what happened in 1946. But that could be a gnome, it could be witchcraft, it could be magic, higher magic, something that happened with Eldermans in 1946 was already there, but for Bob it was hocus pocus because he couldn't make anything out of it. So he started trying to make sense by combining all those topics together. That's how eventually the Gnome manuscript came in place, because all those data about gnomes were in one big folder. He wrote to Reem Portfleet. I don't know if you are familiar with his work. He made the book The Gnome, quite popular in worldwide. But that book, that artist was someone Bob looked up to, and he wrote to him that he had a folder with 410 thin-leaved pages concerning information about gnomes. So we know that the originals are still somewhere out there, but we fortunately have the copies right here and in the collection of the family of Bob. The Gnome manuscript, it's called the Gnome manuscript, but it isn't really a manuscript about gnomes. There's also a lot of information about witchcraft, about the Knights Templar. There are all these little pieces going through it. So the first thing that I did with the Gnome manuscript was actually get the information of the gnomes out of there and try to categorize it into small categories of what gnome migration was about, gnome clothing was about, gnome tools. There was pages full of drawings about the tools that the gnomes used. And in this final third part, I found that the stories of people Eldermans spoke about gnomes should have their own place. So that's actually the bulk of the third part of the book. The second part of the Gnome manuscript, the Gnome Grimoire, is more about the magic concerning gnomes and fairies. And in the third part, I actually try to make an overview of gnome culture, gnome speech, gnome eating habits. Actually, more the origins of the gnomes. What kind of stories did Eldermans collect about them? And Bob, really not knowing what to do with them, eventually visited a fair in Paradiso in Amsterdam, the great stage for all kinds of artists. And every December they had a fair for small publishing houses, and there was one small publishing house who just published a book about people who claimed to see gnomes. So Bob passed the table, sees the book, reaches into his pocket, pays for it, wants to walk away, but then turned to the woman and said, "Listen, I have all these pages about gnomes. I don't know what to do with it. Could you please help me?" And then the story of the Gnome manuscript turned into a small book called Kabouter zien anders kijken, or To see gnomes is to look in a different way, which was published in 1989. In the book I have a picture of Bob looking over the book with a silly smile, as he called it himself, and the author looking into the camera, and Bob trying to hide his emotions because he finally succeeded in what he was set out to do, namely have a book about his father-in-law in print. Finally. So, I'm wondering what Bob would have thought if he could have seen The Silent Listener, which is the biography of his father-in-law. Could he have approved of it, because it paints a totally different picture than Bob would expect. But then Bob became the topic of a biography of himself, Gallowmen and Mandrakes. I hope that he can look from the hereafter with the typical Richel smile, because it was a man with a tremendous sense of humor. I spoke one of his friends who remembered that he was in the hospital, and he knew that the other patients in the room were not very keen to hear what he had to say, and then he got this devilish grin and he said it anyway. So that's the kind of man we're talking about here. He was I have seen a lot of his personal writings, and most of them are dealing with humor, with dirty jokes, with some childhood memories of Bob looking into stores where a child actually shouldn't look, but he did it anyway. And okay, the owner came out and twisted his ear, but he could look back on something very remarkable. So the Richel collection, as it came here in the year 2000. But it's quite hard to make out which piece is Eldermans and which piece is Bob Richelle, because both men were equally skilled in making all these objects. And it's also not really known what objects they bought or what they traded, because they were quite busy with buying and trading. Bob even sold pieces from his own collection to get another piece that he really wanted. So there are still pieces of the Richel collection out there that we don't know of. Object over here, we know that that is one of Bob Richelle, because we found a photograph of his apartment in 1966, and it was there hanging on the wall. So, and the same could go for the pentagram over there, hanging in the casing. The piece over here, Tetragrammaton, from the work of Eliphas Levi. I think it's called Transcendental Magic in English. In Dutch it is translated as Leer en Ritueel van Hogere Magie, over the teachings and practice of higher magic. But Bob should have had that book and made that copy over there for himself. But yeah, there are also pieces that are undeniably Eldermans, and Eldermans was always very helpful for us researchers by making these small explications on paper and sticking them underneath or on the back of a sculpture or somewhere. Yeah, I think you've seen him, Simon.
Yeah.
A small explication by Eldermans on the backs also of his framed works. If you turn over one of these, there will always be a small explication. He also did it on his sculptures. Over there, the lead phalluses, Bob. How do I know? Because I talked to one of his friends and he said, oh, Bob was always casting these lead phalluses and putting wax over them. Exactly those words. He wasn't very impressed with Bob's casting technique, but yeah, those are Bob. The one over here, also Bob. Why? Because we know of a Christmas card that was sent by a friend of his, an artist, Vincent Dame, who actually had this figure on the front of the card. And Bob made a small statue out of it. The Baphomet, Bob. Certainly. He was actually very proud of that piece. He gave it to Graham King as a present when he visited Bob in February of 2000, a month before Bob passed away. And the story goes that Graham forgets to take the Baphomet with him. So eventually, when the transport was made of the Richel collection to Great Britain, there was special care that the Baphomet was in the box, ready to go with Graham. And yeah, there are also pieces that actually aren't made by even Eldermans or Bob. The dagger over here with the phallic hilt, that's Vincent Dame. It's an artwork. It's not a ritual object or whatsoever. It was a set of cutlery with phallic hilts. So there was a fork and a knife and a spoon, and only the knife survived. So are there any questions about Mr. Richel?
I've always been fascinated by the what do they call it? The technique of the folding paper and what's it called? It's called Wartime.
Which one do you mean?
The lower, the 5 images. Of the
5 images. Yeah, it's suspected that also those were made by Vincent Dame.
Ah, okay.
As an artwork. Vincent Dame was quite a peculiar artist in the Netherlands. He was also known because he made genitals out of everything. You could give him a nutshell and he make genitals out of them. You could give him stone, he would make genitals out of them. And he was also very keen on collecting sanitary napkins, and he was also working on pages from the Bible. I don't know if these are the genuine article, but pages from the Bible smeared with menstrual blood from women. And I have a small indication that these might be the things that Bob would have bought because it interested him a great bit. Anything with sexual magic, dark magic, Bob would be very interested. And if you wonder if Bob was an occultist or a practicing magician, I don't think he was. Maybe because he was also trying desperately to find a connection with a magical society or with the Rosicrucians. I tried to get the Lectorium Rosicrucianum in Haarlem to open their archives so I could find out if Bob indeed tried to apply. They wouldn't cooperate, so we only know what Bob has written.
Eldermans was, surely?
No.
No, either?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Eldermans, well, he did cultivate the myth around him.
Yeah.
He was very keen to do that, but he also cultivated the myth that he was a high-ranking public, how do you call it? Huh? Ambtenaar.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, see? No, he was a high-ranking officer for the Justice Department in the Netherlands. He cultivated that myth as well. When I looked into his personal files, I saw that he was just a probation officer of the Dutch Probation Council in The Hague. And he was the lowest officer, and he never was promoted during his entire career.
Right.
But recently I'm reading a biography of J.H.W, and it appears that he lied his total life about everything that he has done. So I have the impression that Eldermans had some kind of example, and he decided to follow it. People will believe what I tell them. And what I understood from his granddaughter was that he had the personality to make people believe that he was who they thought he was, but he was very keen on hiding his personal history as well. We came across a file in The Hague in the National Archives, and the file of Eldermans was missing. The only thing that we found was a small piece of paper with who took it out in 1970 and never brought it back. And there was a strange signature, and I could make out it was Bauma, what was stated in the name. And Mr. Bauma was the superior of Eldermans and the probation council. So I think maybe he got Mr. Bauma to get the file for him, or he forced the autograph and got the file himself. But there was something in the file that Eldermans not wanted to share with the world. And I think that it was his salary, but that's my guess. He worked for the probation council, but he had the salary of a police commissionary, and those two don't match. So there is some kind of arrangement made that Eldermans was paid better than his colleagues. But then, we have to get the file to know it. But on the other hand, Mr. Eldermans also lied about his military rank. He was a corporal, but he told everyone he was a lieutenant. And in 1947, that's a file we could trace back. There was indeed mentioned that Mr. Eldermans is not mentioned in the roll books of officers. And, they called him into The Hague to explain himself. But what followed, we don't know. But he was quite skilled in burying his own past and wiping out his own trails. A lot of the information that I could gather was out of family archives.
Mandrakes.
Mandrakes.
Yeah, are
Bob.
they're mostly Bob, are they?
Yeah, mostly Bob.
Right.
Bob was fascinated with Mandrake roots.
Right.
We know that Bob bought a Mandrake in the 1980s, and that he had the Hortus Botanicus in Amsterdam declare that it was a genuine Mandrake root that he made into a Mandrake man. And one of the stories that concerns this museum is that Bob was here in 1998 for about an hour and a half, because they had to draw a long drive from Hove, near the southeast of Britain. And Graham liked Bob so much that he gave him a Mandrake root. But what Graham forgot was that if you give away a Mandrake, it could mean or harm, or the Mandrake would find its way back to the original owner. And that's exactly what happened when Bob's collection came back here. But the Mandrake root was by then worked into a Mandrake man by Bob. Which one it was, I don't know, but there are a few that I recognize from the photographs from Bob's collection. And the small caskets are made by his father-in-law.
Okay.
But there are also in the library, you have the Mandrake manuscript, small manuscript, in which are stated that the Mandrakes should be bathed regularly in red wine, and that they had to be laid to rest in their casket on white or red silk. So I was always looking for where's the red silk, but apparently Bob did not. Funny story to tell about it. Bob obtained seeds of Mandrake roots, and he got this whole description of when to plant them, when to take care of them, and when to repot them into a garden. Bob lived on the first floor of a Amsterdam flat, so a garden was kind of a challenge. So eventually Bob went to his daughter, who had a house on the ground floor with a garden. So he managed to trick her into the fact that he could grow his mandrake roots in her garden. But then Bob one day visited and he saw that the mandrake plants were attacked by snails. And he didn't like that a bit, so he went to the store, got a lot of snail poison and sprinkled it richly between the plants, giving him a huge fight with his son-in-law because he was, I have cats walking around here, I have children walking around here, and you're spraying poison. So Bob was kind of, okay. But those 5 plants he grew in the garden of his daughter are also worked into Mandrake Man. And he named them his most prized possessions in his collection. His beloved Mandrake Man was exact words. So I think that if Bob would see this, that he was quite content with where they ended up. He was actually very scared that the mandrake roots would end up in the trash can, or worse, that they would be given away or sold to people who didn't care about them. So he's the roots eventually ended up here, displayed like this. He will not come to haunt you.
It's nice to know.
What about the box with the sickle and the wheat?
That's an Eldermans thing. If you look in the box, you can see that there are seeds inside, and there is a phallic symbol that is typically an Eldermans fascination. I think this one is from a magazine that was published in the beginning of the 20th century, Anthropophyteia, which was about sexual behavior of primitive cultures, but also their magical traditions. And some of these traditions had to get fertility in the land. You had to have the seeds, and in some cases they were mixed with semen or and then buried. And this was actually something where the seeds were accompanied by a phallus symbol and locked in the box, and the box would be buried in the ground.
Right. Okay.
On a certain part, and then they hoped that fertility would come to the land. And this custom in the eastern part of the Netherlands, Twente. The Eldermans lived there from 1936 to 1949. But that is indeed a typical Eldermans. He was also very interested in a ritual, an annual ritual that was called cutting the Japiksharf. And that was a bound together wheat that was placed in the middle of the land, and then around that women dressed in white garments would start mowing the wheat. Eldermans always thought that it was a kind of magical tradition, but it wasn't. It was just a folklore tradition in the Netherlands, that people in white garments would cut the first bread of the year. But Eldermans did suspect a lot of more magical traditions in the Netherlands that actually weren't there. He was also looking over to other cultures and traditions outside of the Netherlands, like with the Jonis here. That's something that's not typically Dutch. There's also somewhere a Shelenagik that he made, which is from this side of the North Sea, but he was also very interested in that. If you look what the man has read, a lot of the books are English. So he was also looking into a connecting factor between English magic and Dutch magic, but Dutch magic isn't very known because it was already rooted out around the 17th century. And it made a come back in the 19th century, but you can never say it was the same kind of rituals that were performed before the 1600s. And Eldermans was always trying to make that connection, to look at other cultures and to try to piece together what was the magical tradition in the Netherlands.
What about the art down here then?
That's Eldermans.
Right, okay.
That's Eldermans. That one is not. That's an Eldermans. That's an Eldermans. Eldermans also signed his work with the names of other people. Well, he made. He tried to make the tradition that way by actually forging the work, but there were also all kinds of names that he mentioned in his manuscript about people who were magicians in the Netherlands who never existed. There was a H. de Silva in Amsterdam. I haven't found the man. While other people in Twente, where he mentioned the name and the address, those people we could find back in the archives, but all those people he talked about with magical studios and all kinds of workshops with higher magic, none of them. And yeah, that's when it started to dawn on me from Mr. Eldermans is trying to pull our leg here. Also because he never made the impression that he had read something essential in the magical world. He could cough up all the titles, but you could not make out that he actually read the book. He read it in a book by Peter Haining or in a book by... It's the same thing that people thought that he was in contact with Cecil Williamson. There are loads of information you can find online Eldermans and Cecil Williamson knew each other through the Secret Service. Eldermans was never in the Secret Service. And Williamson, he got that name from Peter Haining, Frank Smith, all those English authors who published small pieces of Cecil's work. And Eldermans filled it out and he made it his own. But he also attributed a lot of things that Cecil never said or wrote. But like the what was it? The Satan Gnome? When I was here for the research for the Book of Eldermans, there was one picture that Peter showed me about a contraption that Cecil had made in his garden to catch a elemental. Indeed, a mandrake. But he based this mandrake drawing on a drawing made by his father-in-law, which is in the library here. And how do we know that? Because of these two symbols. He copied them from that drawing. And there is this, Bob also tried to make a tradition out of it, being somewhat the new steward of the collection his father-in-law tried to maintain. And we know that Eldermans at the end of his life started destroying a lot of works, and that he also put aside a lot of boxes with material that should have been destroyed, and we have strong suspicions that those materials were not destroyed but were sold to someone who came along to buy some utensils, household utensils, and saw the work and said, I really want to buy some of that stuff. And that his wife, the idea from, he's dead, he cannot see it, he will not notice it, take it away. And that's how another collection ended up in Switzerland with about 3,000 pages of Eldermans' work. But here it is, the life of Bob Richelle in a single book. It was a lot easier to research than Mr. Eldermans, I can tell you, because Bob was very candid and very honest about himself. He was only silent about a few episodes in his life, and yeah, I cannot blame him for that, because if you know what happened in those Emsland camps where he presumably was captured, I think it would mark a man for the rest of his life.